I want to now look briefly at our second philosopher dealing with the Euthyphro. This is now Santos's reaction to Geach's. So remember that the Socratic fallacy, as Geach said, had those two presuppositions. One about, if you know a term T, if you're able to properly predicate a term, like use the Hosean correctly to say what's Hosean, what is it, to discriminate and pick them out, you must be able somehow to articulate a definition. You must know what it means to be the Hosean, some kind of criterion. And the second one is that examples aren't going to get you there, right? You're not going to get that kind of knowledge. And we saw that the second part, that knowledge, that examples being useless, that second presupposition actually is derivable from the first. So that's our Socratic fallacy according to Geach. Geach says that Socrates commits this fallacy. It's got all kinds of bad consequences. And now, a few years after Geach publishes that article, maybe about 5-ish years, this fellow comes along and says, I want to revisit this because I'm not sure Geach is right. Now, he doesn't think Geach is wrong about everything. For instance, he says, if you look at the Socratic fallacy and you look at the two presuppositions that it has, Santos says, well, yeah, if you embrace that, if you think that knowing that you don't know that you don't really know, or that you can't predicate a term T, talk about the Hosean, right? Predicate the Hosean of various things. You can't do that unless you're able to articulate, what this concept or the definition of the Hosean is. So you can't predicate without having this conceptualized knowledge, and you can't get that conceptualized knowledge via examples. That altogether is a bad way of thinking. Santos says, yeah, you're right. But the question is that you're saying that Socrates is you named the fallacy after him, and you try to make the case that Socrates' rejection of examples and all this is an example itself of the Socratic fallacy. Santos is saying, I'm not so sure of that. I'm not so sure that of this bad thing with bad consequences, that I agree it has bad consequences, but I'm not agreeing that Socrates actually thinks that way. And so what he zeroes in on specifically for us, because we have read the Euthyphro, is he disagrees with the way Geach reads the Euthyphro. So remember, Geach's interpretation of the Euthyphro is that Socrates, as he's going after Euthyphro and all those definitions and all that stuff we looked at, that Socrates is exhibiting a bad form of thinking, right? The Socratic fallacy. That's Geach's line, right? So you got Socrates making his case, Geach saying that Socrates is committing the Socratic fallacy in the Euthyphro and other dialogues, but don't worry about them. Just worry about what Geach says Socrates is doing in the Euthyphro. So Socrates is reasoning poorly in the Euthyphro. Santos is saying, wait a second, I don't think Socrates is reasoning poorly, or at least I don't think he's reasoning in the way that Geach says he's reasoning, namely according to the Socratic fallacy. So he's saying that Socrates really doesn't make these. Santos is saying that no, Geach is wrong. Socrates doesn't really make these presuppositions, so he's not guilty of the Socratic fallacy. So Geach's interpretation, remember that reading, is what Santos is trying to challenge. So what we've got here is a primary text, Geach's interpretation, which I call GI, and then Santos' reaction to the GI, saying, no, GI is not a good interpretation of the Euthyphro, the primary text. So you've got three texts all related. So the question is we've got three parts in the Santos article, and he discusses, first in part one, he discusses the different ways in which Socrates does reject examples, and that it's a little more nuanced, he says, than what Geach says, that Socrates doesn't reject examples in a way that would support Geach's claim that Socrates is committing the Socratic fallacy. So you want to look at how Santos interprets or reads what's going on in Socrates' rejection of examples, and does that really support or go against what Geach says that Socrates means by rejecting examples. So we're getting into some fine-grained territory. And aside from in part two, right? So part one deals with the rejection of example. Part two of Santos's paper, he asks and says and answers that the answer is basically it doesn't work. That he says, aside from rejecting examples, what other evidence does Geach present for attributing the first assumption to Socrates? So remember, assumption A. You can't predicate the term T unless you're able to articulate or provide a definition or a criterion for T. Otherwise, you can't do it. Other than the rejection of examples, what else does Geach present as evidence that Socrates actually accepts presupposition A? And remember, B follows from A. So if you could get it where, as Geach does, if you can get Socrates to admit to A, then you've got B. But Santos is saying, I don't think you've got with examples or any other evidence to show that Socrates even admits that first presupposition A. And if you can block that, then once again, Santos has got a case against Geach saying, no, you're misreading the dialogue. He's not committing the Socratic fallacy. And so in part three, basically Santos is saying that the evidence reviewed, so he's summing this up, that no, Geach isn't right about this. Socrates doesn't have this sort of Socratic fallacy or this doctrine that, the proposition or presupposition A and presupposition B, that he's saying, no, Socrates really didn't hold those. That's a mistake that Geach makes. The evidence instead shows that Socrates didn't have that doctrine, which Geach calls the Socratic fallacy. Rather, Socrates had a problem, had an issue that puzzled him. And what really puzzled Socrates, and it puzzled Plato, and it has puzzled a lot of philosophers, in that Socrates couldn't really think of, he couldn't really understand. It puzzled him that we could maybe have knowledge of a concept or a term or whatever, that we could have knowledge without being able to articulate a definition. Socrates found that very mysterious, very, very puzzling, right? Not to say that, as Geach does, that, you don't have knowledge unless you can articulate a criterion. Plato just, what Santos is saying is that Socrates found it, well, you probably can, but it's, or he's not sure, but it's definitely really puzzling to have knowledge without being able to articulate a knowledge of a concept without being able to articulate that concept in some nice, tidy little definition. So he just couldn't see, as Santos says, Socrates really just had this problem that he struggled with, and he couldn't come down on one side really or the other. But he's not arguing in this bad way that Geach says. So knowing a concept without knowing a definition of it, like knowing how to use these terms, which, it seems that we do, without being able to define it. Like, I don't know what art is, but I know it when I see it. Or like this, know it when I see it without being able to define it. Geach says, well, that Socrates is ultimately kind of rejecting that possibility. Santos is saying he's not really rejecting it. He's just finding it incredibly puzzling and mysterious. So your task is to find out exactly how Geach is thinking and ascribing the Socratic fallacy to Socrates in the Euthyphro. And Santos's reaction is saying is that Geach's interpretation is in the end fundamentally flawed.